today. My name is Chris Riata, and I'm a reporter for FCW covering cybersecurity, government technology, and federal procurement. I'm so excited to be discussing the topic of securing endpoints while adhering to zero trust standards today, which basically fits into all three of those buckets. Endpoint security is a mission critical practice for agencies across the federal government to ensure their endpoints or entry points for end user devices like laptops and cell phones are protected against exploitation by cyber criminals and other malicious actors. As endpoint security has become a prime focal point in modern day cybersecurity processes, so has zero trust, with the federal government releasing a trove of guidance and specific mandates in recent years. And as we know, developing a zero trust framework which adheres to new federal standards requires leaders to be paying close attention to the devices their employees are using, which we saw become a real challenge throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. So how exactly can agencies secure endpoints in our current reality? And what should they consider moving forward to not only comply with zero trust standards, but also ensure their systems are protected from major threats? To discuss this and so much more, I'm delighted to be joined by Amy Hamilton, Senior Advisor for National Cybersecurity Policy and Programs at the Department of Energy. And we're also joined by Matt Marston, Vice President of Technical Account Management for the Public Sector at Tanium. And to begin, I think it would just be helpful if each of you can describe your current role and responsibilities and sort of how your work fits into this important issue. Amy, how about we kick it off with you?
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. I'm super excited to be here today. And I think that this is such an important topic. As you're aware, last year in May, Executive Order 14028 came out for improving, cybersecurity across our nation. And this has really been the emphasis for a lot of the zero trust architecture work that we've been building on since then. And for the Department of Energy, we have a very unique mission in the fact that we both proliferate energy. We have a nuclear component to our mission. There's all the day-to-day business for our mission, open science mission. And so really since the start of the executive order, it has been my mandate for my organization really working at how we're going to do zero trust, but how do you do zero trust enabling the mission and really basing it on a risk-based approach? And you brought up some really great points about how do we also do this in this new hybrid environment. Definitely the pandemic has accelerated the remote work movement. It's accelerated our need to have, our endpoints secured any place, anytime, and literally anywhere in the world. And in some places, not even in the world. When you look at kind of, our missions on things that are on satellites and things like that, like you really have to look at it is, how are we going to take this to the next level? And one of the really important things is a lot of people are like, how are you measuring this? What's the judgment? And a lot of times we're looking at things like our scorecards. But the real measure is our adversaries, are they getting in? Are they taking advantage of our information, of our data? And, they don't really care what your scorecard is. These adversaries, these bad actors, they want to get into our networks and they're looking for those weak points. They're looking for those end users who are at a cafe, who don't have the right settings. And then we as cybersecurity professionals have the challenge of how can we do this and make it easy? How can we do what people need to do from their work computer so they're not having to log on to their home computers and use other workarounds?
Got it. Interesting. I'm excited to dig into the executive order and more of those sort of key points that you laid out there. But before that, Matt, can you describe a bit about your current role and responsibilities at Tanium and how it fits into this conversation as well?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and welcome, Amy. My job is to oversee all of the field engineering support for the public sector customers at Tanium. We support broadly across the Department of Defense, federal civilian government, and state and local agencies across the world. And we see some of the most challenging and diverse distributed environments that customers can bring to the market. So as an endpoint management platform, we are heavily focused on helping customers adopt zero trust strategies, secure their endpoints, and provide maximum flexibility and capability to users, regardless of where they're connecting from and what accesses they're required to have.
Wonderful. Pretty important considering the federal agencies are, at all different sort of points along the zero trust journey. So having that sort of flexibility is definitely, I think, an important part of this discussion. Well, there's a lot to discuss, so let's just jump in. If any audience members have questions for Amy or Matt throughout the panel, feel free to send those in and we'll get as many answered as possible near the end of the conversation. Amy, how about to start, can you share some of the challenges which agencies may face in securing endpoints, especially at a time when remote and hybrid work, as we've both said, has become a norm for many employees, and as we've seen, bring your own device policies becoming increasingly popular especially since the start of COVID-19.
So I think that all agencies are experiencing this very similar challenge right now. And when you look at remote work and hybrid work, there's a lot of really great advantages. And part of that, is the environmental advantage, of people not coming in and commuting every single day. A lot of people find that they're able to do what they call deep work when they work at home. So they can spend that time really going into things like when the executive order first came out, or M2209. I think I read M2209 at least 6 times before I really started to sink in how overwhelming the amount of work was going to be. And so when you look at this specific area of endpoints, it's addressed both in the executive order, then it's addressed in M2201, it's addressed again in M2209, and it's really letting us know from the administration that this isn't going anywhere. And when you look at what we need to do, and whether it's called EDR, XDR, MDR, it seems everybody wants to get it in a different name, so they want to add their nuance. It's really about making sure that for your end users that we're able to secure them. And a lot of what we're doing is we're working with our community, both the cybersecurity professionals as well as users, and getting a better understanding of use examples. So, I brought up, for instance, somebody working from a cafe, right? But, we used to face this when people traveled, especially when people were doing overseas travel. And one of the things that we would do is we would simply give out a loaner laptop, let them go to a country, bring that laptop back, the loaner laptop, and, go ahead and clean that laptop. But, that's not realistic for day-to-day use. So we're really having to look more of how do you make sure that, the machine is provisioned in such a way that they can get access to what they need to get access to. And then also really looking at those, phishing resistant credentials, which constantly comes up on our rule for ICAM. And it's really an understanding of all of these things are linked together. You can't just have a good EDR solution. You can't just have a good ICAM solution. You can't just have microsegmentation. All of these things have to be a mesh and complement each other. And, when people were looking at the old model of the moat and castle, it really never worked for anybody but the kings and queens anyways, right? All the peasants out in the fields and stuff, they were always just getting sacked and stuff. And really, if you look at the model for our end users, that's what's been going on historically, is the end users have been super vulnerable when they're not behind that moat and castle, and we have to protect them no matter where they're at. And really just kind of, forget about the Renaissance fair and move into the modern age, and, move into having our individualized little force fields, and, be more sci-fi than Renaissance fair.
I love that. I love that. Great analogy. Yeah, Matt, I guess thinking about moving away from the Renaissance fair, and thinking about that perhaps that federal employee sitting at a cafe, I imagine endpoint security systems must have become an increasingly sought after tool to help organizations get up to speed when it comes to protecting endpoints on a network or in the cloud from cybersecurity threats, especially in this kind of remote era that we're in now. Can you sort of share how endpoint security systems have factored into organizations' ability to combat cyber threats while continuing to modernize their internal operations and allow for these hybrid and remote capabilities?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. And you brought together a couple of terms that I think are really important here, and absolutely critical to a conversation around distributed workforce and modernizing an IT approach to security and operations and configuration management. When we pushed to home and everybody went out of the traditional workspace and went to a work from home model or a hybrid work model, we really accelerated what was ultimately going to come to bear anyway. Workforces have continued to evolve to such a place where people are doing their best work in different locations at different rhythms. And so this was really just an accelerant to overall what we would have ultimately seen in IT modernization. But really it comes down to converging IT operations and security and getting an overall risk picture for both your user, the device that they're connecting to, and then ultimately being able to make real-time informed decisions about what's happening on the network. The user has always been the weakest link in any security posture. Through phishing emails, configuration drift on their devices, certainly bring their own devices. That's always been the the preferable attack vector for our adversaries. And so it's really important as we modernize and continue to broaden the scope of our user base to push security out to the farthest part of the perimeter as we can. And that really is the end user of the device. So as a security and operations platform, this is really our sweet spot. We help to minimize configuration drift, provide positive management capabilities and policy enforcement across the entire enterprise, as well as do the traditional security operations, threat hunting, incident response, and alert management.
Got it. You know, that's interesting when thinking in line about the sort of bevy of zero trust guidance and kind of requirements for agencies to build out their zero trust frameworks and kind of thinking about how, you know, the end user is sort of the most susceptible. Amy, how exactly can agencies best set up those strategies without making it a practice in compliance? How have you seen the Department of Energy and maybe some of your colleagues across agencies you know, take effective steps to hone in on this area?
Well, at the Department of Energy, what we found to be very successful is we're working across the department with our components, our departmental elements and sites, and pushing down the ability to look at their strategies, their local policies, and how they want to set up their zero trust plans. And really, it's an understanding of what are the user requirements. And it was a really great point about the workforce. So when you look at operating a vehicle, I want to be able to get in my car, turn the key, and drive it. And I don't even care anymore if it's a combustion engine or an electric engine, right? I mean, it's really kind of seamless to me as a user. I just want to be able to go to the grocery store in my car. But when you look at what we've done a lot of times in cybersecurity, we've started putting so much burden on the users that users just look for ways around it because they don't want to know how the combustion engine works. They don't want to know what's behind the scenes. They want to just be able to go and get the functionality that they need. And we as cybersecurity professionals need to give them what they need. So in some cases, you know, it's going to be different than others. And it's all going to really be based on the mission. And a really great point in the diversity of the workforce now too is it's not just that people are no longer going into a centralized office, but now we've really started to look at what does the remote workforce mean? You know, this means I don't have to hire people just, you know, in the DMV. I can start hiring people from across the United States and having them come in. And then this also is a shift from synchronous and asynchronous communications, looking at core hours and all these things. And so there's a lot of different factors that are going in and really understanding our user behavior analytics, what's normal for a user, what's not normal for a user. And all of these things get tied together. And for the endpoints, one of the things that's just super critical that you would think everyone would have a handle on now, and you know, I'll just say it's definitely still a lot to be desired. It's just your basic asset management. You have to know what those endpoints are, how they should be connecting. You know, like you mentioned, if you do have a use your own device policy, what are those policies? How are people able to log in and to access applications in your networks? So everything really is just sort of tied together, and you can't look at any individual component and focus on it. It's kind of like that analogy of keeping all the plates spinning, and you know, you focus on the endpoints one day, and then the next day you're focused on your ICAM, then the next day you're focused on your user behavior, and then it's like wash, rinse, and repeat on that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, that's a really interesting point. I think you and Matt are both kind of speaking to when we look at who the user actually is, it's the workforce, right? And if we peel that back a little bit, like a lot of this must have to do with the culture of the agencies and the organizations kind of involved in improving those cybersecurity practices. So how exactly can agencies then get buy-in across from the entirety of the organization to ensure that their employees are helping in those efforts to secure endpoints, especially at this time when employees themselves are particularly susceptible to being used as entryways for malicious actors and cyber threats? Matt, do you want to take that one first? And then I'd love to hear both of your thoughts, actually.
Yeah, and it's a great question. It really is a paradigm shift. So the workforce is the center of focus for all of our security posture changes, implementations. That's really the center of gravity. And the user device is what contains the majority of the data. So when we talk about data as a strategic asset in zero trust or in any enterprise, most of the data is contained at the point of production, which is where the user sits. So we tend to implement the most controls where the user is attached to the network And we have to do that in a way that doesn't disrupt their ability to get their job done. Users inherently want to do great work, and they don't want to be hindered in their ability to access resources and get the job done. So it's incumbent on us as security leaders to make sure that we can implement policies and protocols and security tools and mechanisms in a way that still allows that user to have maximum utility and flexibility to do what they need to do to deliver on the mission. Any disruption and any difficulty in getting the work done is certainly going to create a situation that Amy described, where creative and innovative and intelligent users are going to find workarounds. And that's the worst case scenario. You don't want your users actively working around security protocols.
Any additional thoughts there, Amy?
Well, I think that there's a few things, and just to really build on that is some great points about the enablement of our users, and they are very savvy, and it's very generational right now. When you sort of look at the older end of the spectrum, and the boomers who are in the phase of retiring, but they didn't really grow up with digital technology. Then you have those kind of people who were the digital pioneers who were out there doing coding on cassettes and everything else back in the day, and then you kind of have this new generation who's entered the workforce, who've completely grown up with technology, and they've lived with smartphones in their hands since their earliest ages, and can't imagine what it would be like to use an actual map to get anywhere. And so, like, you've brought these three generations in with technology with very, very different expectations. And especially the more that we're having, millennials and Gen Z start coming into the workforce, we have to recognize those expectations and that they will find the workarounds around it. And I think that Simon Sinek put it very well when he talked about the power of why. And it's really that kind of what you mentioned, Matt, is an understanding of the culture. And when you can get people to understand why the cybersecurity is important and why there might be one or two extra steps, they're going to be willing to do it. On the other hand, if it's so extraordinarily burdensome, if the latency is so high that they can't make their mission happen, if it puts them hours behind schedule, then people will look for those workarounds. And they're going to balance, speed of the mission versus, the risk of, adversaries getting that data. But I think explaining to the workforce and not treating them like they're not going to be able to understand the workforce, I started off with, 25 years ago, isn't the workforce that we have today. We have so many savvy users who know more about technology than I ever will.
Yeah, Amy, I want to toss it back to you quickly and ask sort of a little bit more about those interagency efforts to help on this front. We've seen a lot of those across the federal government in recent years around zero trust, particularly, and many of those obviously led by CISA. CISA itself has released a maturity model which allows for some amount of flexibility we talked about earlier in establishing these processes. Can you speak to how agencies are collaborating with CISA and working across government to ensure they're adhering to these zero trust standards and protecting against known vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think that the relationship right now, and what I will give a shout out is that the CISA CyberStat program has been really great, and CISA has really recognized the need for agency flexibility as they've been developing their models. They worked in conjunction with the Office of Management and Budget, and then TIC 3.0 with the use cases, so it's not that legacy TIC.1 where everybody was supposed to have a centralized focal point, but recognizing that cloud, ZTA, once again, these things are tied together, and sometimes they're not inherently intuitive when you try to explain to people that you can actually be more secure in the cloud than you can on-prem, right? And so there's a lot of different ways that CIS has really been helping with the educational point. And I also want to just make sure I'm giving some credit as well to the Department of Commerce, NIST. The standards that come out of NIST are so important. They've really been working very, very hard, full steam ahead since the executive order, updating zero trust, and also something very important and near and dear to the Department of Energy is looking at zero trust and how it's applicable to operational technology. So a lot of times people really want to focus, and for endpoints, you think about your user endpoints, which we've really focused on, right? But for Department of Energy, we have a lot of endpoints that aren't users, it's means, right? So it's, when you're providing power, when you're looking at an environmental waste processing plant. These endpoints aren't users, they're actual operational technology. And how does zero trust apply there? How do you apply EDR there? And so lots of different things that need to be explored, because when you look at things like back in Florida, there was a water treatment plant that was compromised. And when you look at that, you never want to see a compromise on something that's operational technology. And how do we do a better job of securing that? How do we make sure that this nexus point between your traditional IT, which is where ransomware came into play, with Colonial Pipeline, which is your operational technology point, you want to make sure that you're really, really aware of that. You can't disrupt the operations, but you have to make sure that the security's there and you can't have any doubt in your systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And the the Florida, the water issue was certainly pretty frightening. I have to quickly ask you, we have an audience question. Actually, I was going to hold these till the end, but we've got a great one going off of NIST and something that you mentioned earlier. So just to sort of piggyback off of that, the NIST 207 document, this is from Rich Streeter, says ZTA is a data-centric concept, and it holds out that a data file could be considered an endpoint. So do you see any sort of movement towards treating data files as an endpoint in and of itself?
I think that there's a lot of discussion around data right now that really should have been taking place the past 10 years. And I just want to say, like, from Department of Energy, we've recognized it. We've actually moved Emery Shulak into being the CDO for our organization and really looking at innovative approaches to data. Because in the end, networks, systems, applications, they don't exist alone. They only exist for the data that's going to be on them. And so, I think data as an endpoint is something that needs to be considered, as well as the overall, data strategy, understanding the risk of data, the importance of your data. Where should your data live? Where should it never live? Who should have access to that type of data? And I think that this is just still fairly early dialogue that we really need to have more discussion around.
Yeah. Matt, sort of posing the same question to you. Where do you think agencies go from here? What are some of the biggest challenges you see organizations facing in the next 6 months to 2 years around securing endpoints while adhering to the zero trust standards that have been coming out in recent years?
Yeah, to the data point, we really look at the modern enterprise as an information environment. And in that information environment, users and devices are at what we consider the data layer. And so that sort of data fabric extends across all user bases, both managed and unmanaged endpoints, IT, OT, all of the devices and pertinent points that Amy just made. It's really critical that we have real-time situational awareness about what's happening within our information environment. The adversaries are all over the place, and they're moving very, very quickly, and they're not necessarily following the same rules that we have and that we play by on our side. So we have to be extremely responsive. We have to have real-time visibility and awareness. We have to know what's happening within our enterprise, what's happening within our information environment, and we have to be able to quickly take action. And I think what we'll see over the next 18 months, 2 years, is we're going to see a significant pivot away from the traditional data lake, data aggregation, historical context approach to security to a real-time situational awareness approach. So much like you would monitor security cameras in a bank or a protected building, you want to know exactly where the adversary is, what they're doing at the time they're doing it, so that you can deploy countermeasures and protections. We need to do the same thing in IT and within the information environment. It's no longer satisfactory to look back over the last 6 months or 36 months to see what the trends were in adversary activity. We have to be able to know when it's happening, where it's happening, and be able to reach out and put in protections at the time of the event.
That makes sense. Amy, with all of the challenges in securing endpoints that we've discussed today, how can agencies, particularly those which may not be as mature as the Department of Energy and their cybersecurity practices, begin to really holistically address this issue while adhering to those zero trust standards we've been talking about?
Well, I think it's really interesting when you look across the federal government, and a lot of times I think when people think of agencies, they think of large agencies like the Department of Energy. But when you look at all the smaller micro agencies, I think looking for shared and common services and solutions is something that we have to do. A lot of times it appears that agencies look at things like a competition instead of looking at the fact that, like, we really are all on the same side. So whether it's going with a Department of Justice, SOC is a service solution, whether it's going with CISA, CDM, whatever it is that you happen to choose. GSA has some great vehicles as well. So I don't want to leave anybody else, NASA soup, et cetera. I'm sure someone's going to say, hey, you forgot to mention my program. But, it's really looking at it should be shared programs. It's like, how do we work together? How do we make sure that we're going for those common solutions, but at the same time, not doing it in a way that's draconian, understanding that there's a very, very different mission. When you're looking, for instance, at the Social Service Administration, it's a very, very, publicly forward, publicly facing organization compared to the Department of Energy. So we have to look at, when we are talking to the rest of the interagency, like, what is their core mission? What is it that they're trying to do? And then making sure that that core mission can happen, but but at the same time, we're very respectful and understanding that security needs to be taking place, underneath. And most of the time, the user shouldn't see it. The user should see things, seamlessly. Like when you go to your bank, you have security, you want your bank to be secure. But at the same time, if your bank is too difficult to get into, you're just going to look for another bank with a better app, and better web-based applications.
Right, right. I'm interested in asking both of you. We've seen this, trove of guidance and guidelines around zero trust and endpoint security, particularly from many different agencies. We hear a lot about cybersecurity being a team sport. There's certainly a lot of players. Have you seen any sort of issues around agencies, organizations simply trying to comply with those standards and just kind of keep up with the rat race of these really ambitious efforts and deadlines that have been laid out in the executive order and elsewhere to comply? Or do you think that agencies writ large are sort of taking kind of innovative, truly modernized, practices and kind of experimentations to get this done? Maybe Amy, I'll toss it back to you first.
So I think it depends on the agency and the mindset. There is still a lot of people who are very compliance mindset. And, in the end, as we've all discussed, adversaries don't care about your scorecard. They care about, what is your posture. And you really have to start thinking like that with more innovation. As far as the trust in working across the agencies, so not zero trust, but in the sense that we all have to have trust when we work with our partners. We have actually had a lot of success. There's been a lot more engagement in the acquisition community than we've had in the past, a lot more engagement with our financial community who owns a lot of the applications really in my environment. And I'm hearing that across the interagency that people are working, in other components of the organizations they have traditionally have not been working with. Because when you start looking at things from a zero trust approach and you start looking at applications and data, the data owners are not the IT people. They're not the cybersecurity people. They're the people who are doing the missions. And having a better understanding of the mission is going to allow you to provide better cybersecurity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Matt, in your experience working with the public sector, are you experiencing a sort of shift away from the compliance mindset, or would you say that those issues are still pretty persistent?
I think there's a bit of a balance, to the point of information sharing and best practice sharing. We're seeing a lot of coordination between not only federal agencies, but federal and state and local agencies as well. Many of our public sector customers at the state and local level take their guidance from what the federal government is doing. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of conversation and engagement between state and local customers and our federal customers as well, which is really encouraging to see. And with the compliance question, there's always some measure of compliance auditing support that has to happen. At the end of the day, we have to meet the requirements for the legislation and the policies that are put in place. But it's important, especially with something as long running as zero trust, is this can't be a check the box exercise, right? The departments and the agencies that we work with understand that this is not something that they can just pull off a shelf and plug in and be done with. That this is a really significant shift in the way that we do IT security. And it's really been baked into the modernization efforts at large for these large federal customers. So it's important that they understand that this is an iterative approach. And we're seeing a lot of great decisions being made in acquisition and tool selection. People are moving away from individual point solutions. They're doing tools rationalization and consolidation. And they're really going to a sort of a whole enterprise approach to security. So, Yeah, I think compliance is on everybody's mind, certainly. But really, we're seeing agencies make great decisions about how to implement meaningful changes that help to, again, meet the mission and the objectives that are defined by the organization.
That's good to hear. In a lot of my reporting, I hear that there's big issues around other topics with government agencies and even certain entities within government agencies being so siloed. So when it comes to this issue, it's important, and it's exciting to hear that there's been some collaboration across teams. Amy, passing it back to you. What would be some of your key advice to agencies and organizations, maybe some of those that are just getting started on this effort, or considering new ways to secure endpoints and advance their cybersecurity and zero trust goals?
Well, I think just tying it back to what we're just talking about is don't do it alone. I mean, every other agency is out there struggling, and I was at a I don't know, about December timeframe. We were doing our MFA and encryption plans, and I reached out to a couple of my peers at some other agencies just to find that they were going through the exact same thing that I was. And in the end, like we all started talking to each other more, referencing each other more, asking, hey, how are you handling, this nuance of it? And then was really interesting from there is it kind of then became even at looking at things like our ISO community of practice and how are other people handling that. How are you getting word out to your AODRs, and how are they doing approvals based on ZA, and how have you updated those programs, and really creating it into a conversation. So, even if it's just reaching out to somebody that you know from LinkedIn, or that you worked from somebody in a previous organization, going to these kind of forums and getting to know people, it's just super important to not be afraid to ask the questions and find out what are your peers doing. And what you're probably going to find out is they're struggling with the same kind of problems that you are, and you just might not even know it. So don't be afraid to ask the questions, and solicit the advice from people, because some people are so far ahead in certain areas, whereas others are really far ahead in others. And we can be stronger together and by leveraging each other.
Right. And sometimes it's good to just know that other folks are on the same boat as you. Matt, what are some specific resources you could maybe recommend for audience members that on where to find and share best practices for setting up and maintaining a zero trust approach?
Well, I think CISA is a great starting point. They provided a tremendous amount of easy to digest and understand resources for agencies to use. So regardless of where you are in the zero trust journey, if you're just getting started and doing basic hygiene and asset inventory, all the way through implementation of advanced encryption and MFA technologies, CISA has a tremendous amount of resources. And to Amy's point, reach out to your peers, within the other agencies and departments, talk to those who are in the same position as you, see what they're doing. Most of the customers we work with today are at a point where they're looking to utilize what they already have implemented and operationalized, and seeing how they can adapt that to zero trust principles instead of doing entirely new acquisitions to implement a specific fix or technology. They're trying to do the most they can with what they have, and then make smart decisions about what to add on in the out years. It's much better for budgeting and planning to be able to take that approach. But again, to Amy's point, we have some agencies in the government that are well down the path of zero trust and have been doing this since before it was really called zero trust. And then we have other agencies that are just getting started. So peer groups, the resources that CISA has put together, and then certainly communities of practice. There are a lot of people that are working on this. So there's a lot of resources to be utilized.
All great tips. And Matt, if I can ask one more question that I'd love to hear both of your feedback on, if I can squeeze it in, how would you recommend that agencies and organizations can begin measuring or measure at certain points whether their zero trust practices are working or successful?
This is an interesting question. A measurement is always relatively difficult, but also essential at the same time. So zero trust has certain KPIs. There are certain metrics that can certainly be dashboarded or put into a scorecard, like Amy mentioned earlier. But really, it comes down to being able to identify whether or not technologies are in place, whether they are comprehensively deployed, making sure that the policies that you intend to be enforced are actually enforced broadly. it comes down to basic hygiene things. Do you know every device that's on your network? Do you know its current state and posture? Can you make changes and verify that those changes have taken effect? What software is running in your environment, and what is the version of that software? Once you get those basics down, then it really comes down to the one-by-one implementation of security tools, processes, procedures. Do one at a time, roll it out broadly, make sure that it works, make sure that it's understood and followed and implemented correctly, and then move on to the next one. So don't try to boil the ocean, I think is really what it comes down to.
Great advice. And hey, Amy, how about you? Any thoughts on how agencies can measure success here?
Well, I think that there's a couple different ways to measure it. And as I said, when people get down about the compliance piece and, people are like, oh, the FISMA metrics are so different than they used to be. They've moved the ball. And I'm like, you can't look at it as like there's an endpoint where like once you have all the boxes checked, you're secured, right? And you have to really look at it more like this is a long, long distance race, not even a marathon. A marathon becomes a short distance race. But really what we are in is a race against our adversaries who want to exploit these endpoints, who want to exploit, our trusted networks, which is why we have to move to zero trust networks. And, and the biggest measurement is, every year it comes out who had the major breaches. Like, go with that. Like, don't make the front page of the Washington Post for having a major breach. That's like kind of goal number one, right? And then you start measuring below it. But I think one of the number one ways that you can look on is if you're in the right environment is your community talking about it. So right now, I'm even having people who are in our financial, applications coming to me saying, hey, how can we make these more secure? This wouldn't have happened a year ago. And this to me is really exciting. We're having people from our acquisition community come and say, hey, we're about ready to do a software purchase. We want to make sure that we're looking at this with the right aspects of cybersecurity before we do this. Can we get you from OCIO to the table? Now that's a paradigm change. It's really changing that culture. And it's a hard metric to have is like, how much does your user community know? How educated are they? And what's really exciting, I'm going to go back to traditional phishing is, once we started getting user communities involved and, different organizations have different, things like, hey, there's a phishing star award. And when you can get your user community excited, say, hey, look, I caught like bad fishers and actors and people who aren't cybersecurity people, but just your average person in the workforce for whatever it is that mission happens to be. I mean, that's where you're really changing culture. And that's really kind of hard to measure. But at the same time, you do, from your phishing campaigns, you have those metrics and you can see how engaged is your community and do they understand the real threats.
Yeah. It'll be exciting to see where this all leads and heads to in the next couple of years. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank our guests for joining us today. Thank you so much to Amy and Matt for your time. Greatly appreciated. I also want to thank our underwriter for today's event, Tanium, and you, the audience. We greatly appreciate you attending this discussion. For all future FCW events, you can head over to fcw.com/events. Thanks again for joining us. For FCW, I'm Chris Riata. Have a great day.